Hello, I'm Donovan Bigelow, and this is the fourth section on child development. Now I will be discussing a work by Melanie Klein, a chapter called Weaning. And I was probably in my mid-20s before I understood what weaning meant. It always sounded like no one ever explained it to me, and I apparently didn't have the courage to ask. Before we go any farther, I want everyone to understand what weaning means. Technically, it means the time at which a baby stops breastfeeding. That's all it used to mean. Melanie Klein recognized that to the baby it has immense meaning. And in this chapter I will cover not just weaning, but about a dozen other key child development milestones and how to manage them. But again, back up a little summary. Melanie Klein, in her researches that paralleled and I think deepened Freud's understanding, I think she confirms that the unconscious remains the source of most of our personality and is where most development unfolds most dramatically. The problem is it unfolds dramatically, but we don't see it happening. We can't see the unconscious. We can see derivatives of it. We can see manifestations of it. We can see symptoms of it. And this is where science and psychology have to part company slightly. The method of research here remains infant observation, remains the longitudinal studies of child development. It's a rigorous scientific method that has given us a great deal of fairly hard data. The problem is, at the end of the day, we cannot read anyone's mind. And I think the most complex issue now in psychology, as I think it's becoming even in the entire field of philosophy, is theory of mind. What is a mind? We all feel like we have one. We all can sort of describe how we think of ourselves as mental objects. But I think that remains an area where we remain sort of speculative. There isn't much speculation about the power of the unconscious, and Klein was probably the most adept researcher in bringing that to conscious awareness. One of the things that she became clear on, and this takes last lecture a little bit deeper, I think, is that a baby, an infant's experience overall, not just of specific traumas if there are traumas, but their overall day-to-day experience lays an imprint on that infant's mind that becomes primary, that becomes central, that becomes something something like the core of that child's personality. And the part that is so hard for people to wrap their minds around is this is completely prior to any memory. Nobody remembers your infancy. Freud had a name for it, infantile amnesia. He noticed that adults do not remember anything before they were a couple of years old. There are people who claim to have remembered things in cribs and things, but most of the time it seems like they were told stories later, and then that memory of the story becomes confused with what they actually remember. It appears that neurologically, and this comes from the neurologist, that the brain itself doesn't have the ability to lay down traditionally understood adult memory tracks until after 2 years. Now there's some debate about this, but it seems quite clear at least that infants and babies do not have anything like the normal memory that we have. People seem to come to the very wrong conclusion based on that fact that nothing that happens back then matters because they can't remember it, so it doesn't matter. Nothing is further from the truth. In fact, it is exactly the opposite. It is taken in. It becomes the core of identity. There is no researcher now that in any of the various theories of psychology that believes the first 2 years of life do not stamp a child permanently, characterologically, doesn't lay the foundation, the unmovable foundation for their personality. So the fact that we don't remember it is irrelevant. It remains the formative, birth to 2 years, give or take, remains the formative period for all of our adult characteristics. The next point that Klein comes up with that I think is phenomenal developmentally is that experience accumulates. That the mind, however we formulate our theories of it, is truly like a snowball gaining momentum downhill and gaining mass downhill. every single thing that happens to you, every single thing that happened to you from birth and probably before, is accumulating in your mind. You cannot remember most of your childhood, but it is all there, and the feelings and emotions are embodied. The experience is taken in, introjected, identified with, experienced in some profound way that leaves a trace, and doesn't just leave a trace, I think accumulates to become who you are at the most profound level. Whether it's an internal experience of fear or emotion or love or care, an external experience of those emotions in others, whether it's gratification or frustration, again, internally or externally, all of these experiences become part of all of our minds. Nothing is forgotten, nothing is omitted, nothing can be taken away. Your entire life experience is the sum total. Your mind, your identity is the sum total of all of your life's experiences. We'll come back to this later in the existential lecture, I'm sure. Klein agrees with Dr. Sharp that gratification at the breast is the precursor to adult sexuality. I don't think we have much doubt about that anymore either. Freud said that when we find love, we never really find love. We always re-find love. That our adult sexuality, that our adult tendency toward gravitating toward certain types of relationships is really the re-finding of that primary relationship with the parents, taken in, and then when we find someone similar to that first love, that's what love is. Love is the evocation of the primarily internalized relationship to the parents, assuming it was good enough. So Melanie Klein's in complete agreement about the primacy and primitiveness of early sexual development. She adds something to it, though, that I think is profound, and that's the idea of fantasy. I've touched on this before. Fantasy as the basic building blocks of the mind. This is her attempt to try to make sense of what's going on in a baby's mind. Now, we can't look inside. We can't do an MRI. We can't do a CAT scan of a baby's brain and say, oh, look, all of these neurological events going on, these electrical circuits firing. That tells us nothing about the experience of the baby. That tells us nothing about what's going on inside the baby's mind. It tells us what's going on inside of their brain. But the mind, we don't even know how to talk about it. Klein came up with the first way of thinking about what's actually going on in the unconscious of infants, babies, and I think as well adults, and that's the idea of fantasy. Now, let me be clear. If I buy a lotto ticket, I have a fantasy about what I'm going to do with my winnings. That's a fantasy spelled with an F, as we all understand it to be spelled, and as we all understand what it means. It's a thought of a possibility or an imagining of some event or future events and how things might be. It's a fantasy. Klein took that idea, that basic, obvious idea, and realized, I think fairly accurately, that in a baby's mind, and perhaps in our own unconscious, emotions really are simply objects, fantasies, in complex relationships with each other. That every emotion is really, in a baby's mind, a fantasy. And they're bumping into each other, becoming intertwined, becoming reinforced, or pulling apart, is really the content of a baby's mind. Now this seems quite confusing and quite unreal in some ways. But the simple fact is, no one's come up with a better explanation for how to help babies manage their development. I hope that someone will come up with a better idea. If you have one, write me a letter, send me an email. But up until right now, quite literally, Melanie Klein's idea of fantasy seems to be the most useful. And again, I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to suggest, and I think the literature supports, and my patients certainly respond, to the idea of it as fantasy in ways that are incredibly useful. So as long as it's useful, I'm going to go with it. Melanie Klein also saw that in very young babies, They do not have a fantasy or a thought about themselves or other adults, especially the mother and father, as whole people. As I said in the last lecture, a 2-month-old baby does not greet the mother in the morning with a comment about her dress, how it's becoming this morning, and or how her hair is nicely done, and a comment about the dog. They do not get themselves as whole, the mother as whole, or even separate. It's all a buzzing bit of a confusion. That is critically important for understanding a baby's development. If they really are in a part-object relationship, meaning that their objects, their fantasies, aren't of whole people, aren't of self and mother and other and father and dog and sister and whatever, but they're just pieces and parts. They're like the breast. The baby has a fantasy of the nurturing breast. It isn't a fantasy of the mother as a whole, because the baby's brain isn't wired yet for that complex a thought, and the mind hasn't structured itself enough to be able to contain such a complex idea. So, wow, it's just a breast. Well, what happens if everything is fine and the baby is having a really good feed and the baby is happy and full and content? Then it's obviously a good breast. But what happens if the breast is not there? What happens if the milk doesn't flow? What happens if the baby has a tummy ache? Well, then obviously it's a bad breast. It's a persecuting breast. It's a breast that withholds. It's a breast you can be envious of and hate and be aggressive toward and imagine in fantasy the destruction of. And most importantly, a breast that you want to make go away and bring the good breast back. Now, this feels like a bit of a stretch, and it may sound ridiculous to some of you. Give me a better way to understand a baby's mind. This seems to be a useful understanding. Melanie Klein thought that at about 6 months, this part-object dynamic, if the child takes in enough love, if the child takes in enough good objects, if the child takes in enough care consistently, then the child slowly develops the ability to recognize itself and the other as mother, as whole, and then its psychic sense changes dramatically. What does the baby do inside itself when faced with something painful, bad, difficult? Well, it can do only what a tiny little baby's primitive mind can do. It splits the bad away from the good and makes the bad go away. In fantasy, brings the good in. Thumbsucking. The baby sucks its thumb to bring the good breast back, makes the bad breast go away. Splitting and projection. Introjection, identification with the good feeling, the good experience. Let me back up and add a basics. I think I mentioned this last time. We all start with biology, genetics, then emotion, then thinking, then creativity. We must recognize the biological bedrock of our existence. But the next level up in sophistication is emotion. Thinking is a distant third. 3-month-old babies, 9-month-old babies have emotions. Everyone that's watched a baby for 5 minutes knows that clear as a bell. They can be joyous, they can be afraid, they can be angry, they can be frustrated, they can be all kinds of things. They cannot speak. They do not have language. They cannot think. If emotions are stable, if there are enough good enough emotions, if the bad has been held at bay, if there aren't too much persecutory objects, bad objects, then the baby can develop the ability to think about others in ways that are more reality-based. So a baby's development is going to depend more on love than on the external things that parents do to care for them. A baby can be well fed, a baby can be well clothed, and as the hospitalism example I used in the last lecture, I think proved beyond any doubt, babies can be well cared for physically and die of loneliness if they don't have the presence of a loving mother figure with them. So, how does a baby manage the intensity of these primitive emotions, which we, I think, recognize inevitably are there from birth on at least? And it appears that they split and try to get rid of the bad ones and bring the good ones back. And they will always have an interplay of these things. There's no getting away from frustration. No baby has a perfect life. No baby avoids frustration entirely. And parents that want to structure a life that way are often quite negligent and disruptive of the baby's healthy normal development. Pain, difficulty, hurdles to overcome, frustrations to deal with are part of every baby's normal developmental process. And we'll come back to that a little bit later, but one of the ways that I think Klein's idea of splitting, how Klein's idea of all good and all bad in the primitive mind, what struck me very powerfully not long ago is, wait a minute, isn't that quite common in adults? Don't we keep all the good for ourselves and project all the bad out there? Isn't that what comic books are about? Isn't that what video gaming is all about? There's good guys and bad guys, and there's no overlap. I mean, the cartoon characters, there's good guys and bad guys. That's infantile. That's childish. That's very, very primitive thinking. Human complexity, which Klein said children can achieve at about 6 months, the ability to recognize wholeness in a mother means for the child that they see the mother not as good or bad, not as a good breast or a bad breast, but as a whole mother who might be gratifying, but who also might fail occasionally. The baby then, for the first time, feels guilt. Guilt is a developmental achievement, a maturing, because when the baby's prior to guilt, prior to whole object relating, then any bad things that happens to the bad breast, the bad object, is totally justified because it's got all the bad in there, and I have all the good in me. Does this sound familiar? Hitler, World War II, kill all the Jews. Jews are all the bad. Aryans are all the good. Every genocide from the Sudan to Cambodia can be explained by the eruption of Klein's idea of psychotic levels of primitive anxiety split off, projected out, and then identified in a particular group. It's psychotic. And it's the way babies function in order to maintain some semblance of their own coherence at a very early primitive stage. There's an old Native American saying I've used before. There are two wolves in every man's breast, love and hate. The question is, which one wins? And the answer was, whichever one you feed the most. And I think that old Native American saying, which seems profoundly true to me, reflects Klein's understanding of these split objects, of these emotional dynamics at the very primitive child level that cannot handle a more sophisticated ambivalence of a whole object, but see things split in all good, all bad ways. And it's these fantasies that construct these emotions of all good and all bad. And the reason I say guilt is a developmental achievement is that once you recognize the mother is a whole object, then you also can remember that you very short time ago had some very hostile fantasies about who you now see she is, and you then feel guilt because in a baby and in some teenagers and in some adult minds, it's hard to tell thoughts from actions. That if a baby fantasizes about death and destruction, then they think they had some effect in the world. They can't tell inside from outside very well. And so a mature child feels guilt over the fantasized aggression projected at who they now see is the whole mother. Freud had a patient once who was a terrible philanderer. He cheated on his wife and thought it was all just good, clean fun and showed no remorse at all. And he thought he was dealing with some other issues. And then Freud worked with him for several months. And slowly this guy shifted. And one day he came in and said, Dr. Freud, I feel horribly guilty about what I've been doing to my wife. And Freud simply smiled and nodded slowly and said, you're becoming a decent man. Guilt equated to a recognition that what he was doing was hurting a whole woman, hurting himself, in fact, and that his feeling of guilt was actually a key sign of his own maturity. Klein added one step to that. She added reparation. She added the instinct to repair. And you can see this in children, and you can see this in adults if you're fortunate, that a child who gets angry at his parent and says something bad, or sometimes toddlers will get mad and they'll walk over and they'll try to kick you in the shin, and then you can almost see it right away. They'll feel bad about that, and they look guilty because they feel guilty, because they realize they've done something wrong. In fantasy, they've damaged their loving father or mother, and for which that's a developmental achievement. The Green River Killer, sociopaths feel no guilt. It's one of the key indicators of pathology. If you can feel guilt over the wrongs you've done, you've got hope. Reparation, repair of emotional damage done, is probably as mature as we can get. Klein, I think, is very reality-based and humble in a way in her recognition that humans will never achieve perfect relationships. There will never be a conflict-free relationship. We are, from the beginning, creatures with aggressive and sexual fantasies. We've always taken in some bad object, some frustration, some anger, some fear, some envy. In fact, Klein thought, and I think she's right about this, envy is one of the primary emotions. We'll talk about that more later. But parents who try to pretend that somehow they can raise their children without fear, without conflict, without anxiety, seems to me to be in gross levels of denial. A subtle point in Klein is this idea that frustration in the child always has a relational impact. Children are never frustrated because they don't get something. They're frustrated because the parent doesn't give them something. That makes them angry at the parent. It isn't about not having the thing. It's about feeling betrayed by the parent. Don't you, when you get angry at someone, when you don't get what you want? Do you think, hey, I don't have this thing, it must be my fault? No, almost inevitably. If you're frustrated or angry, that's because that person did something terrible to you. What you don't get is that you've got anger inside of you, which you're projecting out there. And that person may have done something, but the intensity of your emotional response isn't the same as the fault that they have committed. You're adding something from your own store, so that store of all of these hostile, aggressive emotions, so that frustration to the child will inevitably translate into a relational dynamic that we as adults have to recognize. The child isn't frustrated because you won't give him his teddy bear back. The child hates your guts. The child is in fantasy with you in flames. That has an effect on the development of the child later and the development of your relationship. If you don't get that the child's frustration is being translated in the child's mind into a relational dynamic between it and the parent, and if the parent is fantasized as hostile or withholding, that is what the child is taking into itself. Down that road, if you go down that road too far, is inevitably pathology. Okay. On the other hand, when a child is trustworthy, when a child trusts you in the same way, it's because that's the wolf you've fed. You've been trustworthy yourself. The child has taken in that loving experience, that day-to-day atmosphere in the house, that strong character of loving presence in the mother and the father. Feelings of kindness and wisdom within us, trust, I think, is one of the longest term achievements. You can't say, trust me. Trust, the way children understand it, I think is more true. You earn trust, and if you violate that trust, you got to earn it all over again. You hurt someone and tell them trust you right away, something's wrong with you. Trust has to be earned. The ability to trust is a long-term developmental achievement. All right, let's go to the specifics that Klein talks about. And the first one is weaning. That is the title of the chapter. And I think the biggest dispute now is over timing. Clearly, babies, toddlers, young children have to stop breastfeeding at some point. If you're breastfeeding your 8-year-old, something is severely wrong with everybody involved. And there have been folks who thought stopping breastfeeding could be done at 3, 4, 5, 6 months, which now we see is painfully, destructively early, it seems. There was a cover of Time magazine just 3 or 4 months ago, and on the cover there was a woman, very attractively dressed, whose 3.5-year-old son was standing on a stool breastfeeding right on the cover of Time magazine. It was an interesting photo layout. And this 3.5-year-old, who actually, I thought he looked 5 or 6 to me, and that was the question, when do we stop breastfeeding? There's folks who believe breastfeeding to 3 and 4 and 5 even is perfectly reasonable. So that's the question, and there's not a scientific answer to this, because developmental trajectories vary a fair amount. I think the best that science can say now is that 2 to 3 years of breastfeeding is perfectly normal. Less than that may very well be problematic. More than that has to be looked at a case-by-case basis and also may be problematic. The thing that weaning is not is simply the end of breastfeeding. Klein is absolutely right about this. It is a very real loss to the child at whatever age it happens. The relationship to the mother is more than about the provision of milk. It is about all of those other relational dynamics that the child has taken in as the foundation of their existence, their identity, their minds. To take that away before the child's mind is mature enough, stable enough, coherent enough, integrated enough, actually rips the child's mind apart again. It is a trauma of a very real kind. So weaning has to be done with a recognition of the child's developmental stance, their developmental needs, not the convenience of the mother and father, not anything else really. Where is the child developmentally? And I think a good rule of thumb is 2 to 3 years of breastfeeding is perfectly appropriate, unobjectionable. 2 years is probably enough. Any less than that, and you're risking troubles. More than 3 years, I think there are people that will argue that today, but it's an open question, and if you can make it to 3 years, the child developmentally is probably getting everything they can out of the breastfeeding. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but reiterate, the happy mother and child relationship is everything. If breastfeeding is a pain, if breastfeeding is a chore, if it's a duty the mother doesn't like, if the way it's done generates pain for the mother, then it's an absolute developmental problem for the child as well. So you must recognize, in terms of not just the duration, that's just the external parameters of the game. The more important, or easily as important, underpinning is what is the relational context between a healthy mother's mind and the joy and love in the breastfeeding process and what the child takes in. The baby takes in everything, including the mother's love or not. Okay. I think I can say, and I think Klein would agree with this, that breastfeeding relationship, for better or worse, is the template upon which all future relationships are grounded. Get this one right, and most of that child's adult relationships will be manageable. Get it wrong, and there will be messes to clean up for decades. The next issue is one of feeding schedules. Now, in this area, for the last 60 years, there have been what I consider almost a serious abuse of science. Researchers, theoreticians have claimed that if you put a baby on a particular schedule, this schedule, that schedule, it has to be regular, it has to be predictable and consistent. And they basically, it seems, have tried to force babies into their theoretical paradigm, into their fantasy of what an ideal feeding schedule is. Regularity is good. I think Ella Freeman Sharp was right when she wrote about planning for stability. I think one of the primary things in a baby's life that's absolutely necessary for healthy growth and development is consistency, reliability, and stability. The problem is, in this area, it seems that you can go too far. Babies are hungry when they're hungry. They should be fed when they're hungry. And a rigid schedule that has no flexibility for the baby's experience is going to cause trauma at some level to the child, and seems like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're trying to help the baby by imposing a rigid so-called scientific schedule that seems to cause the baby more anxiety than it solves. So feeding schedules are fine. Pay attention to your baby's needs. At some point, feeding on demand, which seems to be the only appropriate way to go in the beginning, the very beginning, post-birth, but at some point must give way to a more regularized schedule. There isn't any disagreement on that. The disagreement is on how rigid, how soon. And I think the only rule of thumb here that makes sense is focus on the needs of the baby honestly, and take the scientists with a grain of salt. The next issue is one, this seemingly a simple one, but it's got some important ramifications. What does the use of pacifiers, binkies, comforters, what's going on with the use of those? What does the baby use them for? What are they a substitute for? And it seems that D.W. Winnicott, I've probably mentioned him before, the great pediatrician who became a psychoanalyst, the guy who probably more than anybody this century knew babies and mothers, he talked about transitional objects. Things like a pacifier, where the baby has it in the mouth, and to the baby, it's a fantasized presence of the breast. This is very soothing. The baby associates the breast, its presence, with the containing experience of the mother's healthy mind and soothing presence, this matrix of maternal love, symbolized and felt by the baby as the breast's presence. A binky, a pacifier, quickly becomes associated with that soothing experience, and babies use them as a substitute for the present mother. Developmentally, they seem to provide a bridge. Winnicott called it a transitional object, an object that helps the child transition between this symbiotic oneness of its experience of itself and the mother at one, and complete, or mostly complete, independence from the mother. This transition is difficult. It's painful for the child. It's often rough, and moments when the child can fantasize about the mother's presence, the breast, in a soothing way. It seems all to the good. Now, there's a counter-argument. I have several students from Asian countries and African countries, and I've been told by several of them when I talk about these pacifiers that they simply don't have them in their cultures, in their more traditional cultures. And so I got curious. I started asking questions about child development practices, and it appears in these cultures that the child is with the mother virtually 24/7 for up to 4 years of life, sometimes a little more than that. And the thought occurred to me, well, of course, those children don't need a pacifier to transition from oneness to independence. They have the mother there most all of the time. What need a pacifier when the mother is actually physically present? So the thought occurred to me, is the existence of pacifiers, comforters, binkies, these sort of things, are they an accusation against Western parenting practices? Is it something that the child has to make do with when what they really need is the present mother? Are there ramifications to the pacifier in the child's development? Is there a gap, a lack? Is something missing? To the child, it cannot be the same as the present mother. That is impossible. So what's missing, and how does that affect development? We don't have good answers to these questions, but I thought my experience with Asian and African mothers, specifically, seemed to ask a question that needs to be asked. We cannot assume that what we do here in the West is the right way of doing things. I think that's obvious now. This one has caused me to ask a question that I never thought I had to ask. Well, everyone's grown up with pacifiers. They're just perfectly fine. They're just the way things are. Well, it turns out they may just be the way things are in the West, but maybe they're not what's good for the child's development. We have to maybe ask some more fundamental questions. This might go along with thumb sucking. I think there are some children in our practices who have difficulty getting themselves off of their thumbs. That the thumb provides the same thing as the binky, the idea of a fantasized breast, a fantasized mother presence. Now, the first advice is, if that's going on, let the child suck its thumb. Let the child be. It may very well be natural. I saw a picture not that long ago in utero of a fetus in a mother's womb, and it was sucking its thumb before it was born. So it's hard to say that this is somehow a reaction to bad development or inadequate parenting. I don't think that's true at all. Thumb sucking seems to be an almost natural, instinctive, pacifying activity some children get into. We'll talk more about a different kind in just a few minutes. But for right now, one has to monitor it. It seems like a natural thing. It's possible that binkies and pacifiers are natural things which can be allowed to go on too long. Maybe it's just about balance. Maybe if children are neglected or away from their mothers too much, they turn to these things in order to make up for a lack they're feeling. That means anxiety. That means frustration. That may mean anger. Where are these emotions going and what are they doing? Parents are responsible for focusing on the needs of the child. If they're sucking their thumbs, the first response is, let them. The second response is, why are they sucking their thumbs? How much are they sucking their thumbs? And it's not the thing, it's the meaning of the thing. Maybe it's perfectly reasonable. Maybe it suggests that parenting schedules need to be changed a little bit. That's the level of analysis we have to stay at. What are the needs of the child? There are some problems in this area with fathers, and I have had several fathers who, when the child has a pacifier or a teddy bear or a blanket, and especially when it's a boy child, the father gets offended. Well, my son doesn't need a blankie, or my son doesn't need that teddy bear. That's ridiculous. And it takes the thing away from the child. Mainly, it seems, because the father can't handle the idea of his son needing a blankie. One wonders how soon the father's blankie was taken away. I assume that's in there somewhere. I'm not kidding. So again, the response to a father seeing his son or daughter with these things is to recognize that if you deny them compensation, if you deny them pleasure, you may be simply forcing them to find pleasure elsewhere in ways that actually may be more damaging than your judgment about the damaging nature of a pacifier, a blankie, or a teddy bear. As far as thumb sucking goes, really, unless there's some problem with the palate, unless it's so repetitive and so consistent that one starts to worry about the skin on the thumb or the teeth structure, if it's that kind of problem, then we need to reassess the child's relationship with its parents overall. If the thumb sucking has gotten to the point of damaging the child's palate or thumb, then there's a whole different set of problems that have to be addressed. All right, next issue, masturbation. Now this one drives everybody crazy. The simple fact is, the last 50 years of infant observation and research has confirmed as a scientific fact that all children, boys and girls, at approximately 18 months old, discover their genitals and discover that it feels good to masturbate. There is nothing wrong with this developmentally, there is nothing wrong with this psychologically, and I'm going to go out on a limb here a bit and say there is nothing wrong with this morally. I get reactions in classes all the time when this comes up, and parents, mothers and fathers, have these, what I think are simply residuals of a more fundamentalist, and frankly, I've got to say, primitive religious belief system. And I know I'm going to get into a lot of trouble here, but this is science. Religious people got all upset when we discovered the world was round and went around the sun. I'm sorry, this is at that level. This is science. It's indisputable. There is no moral failure. It is not a sin for an 18-month-old plus child to find its genitals and masturbate somewhat. Let the child be is the best advice. Most of the time, it is the parent's anxiety around this question that becomes an issue for the child. I'm willing to concede without question that if it becomes obsessive or becomes excessive or obtrusive, then there's a problem. But the problem, if the child is masturbating in public, at preschool, at the grocery store, that is a symptom of something significantly wrong with the child's relationship to its parents. The child, through that excess, is trying mightily to tell the parents it is in distress, trying to tell the parents that this is a displacement of inner experiences of frustration, anxiety, into this sexualized channel where it does not belong and is not healthy at that point if it's excessive. And the parents, again, have to step back and realize it's not the thing, it's the meaning of the thing, and it will frequently require a reassessment of the parent's relationship to the child. When I was young, I remember stories of parents telling their children that masturbation would cause hair to grow on your hand, would cause you to go blind, would make you insane, was a sin. And these things were simply lies that the parents told to punish, to threaten quite serious things to these children who were traumatized by the lies. I had a patient once who told a story about her parenting. No, it was a father. The father had two children, a boy and a girl. The girl was approximately 3, and they were at the breakfast table one morning, and the father was talking about good habits. And the little girl said, "Daddy, what's a habit?" And the father sort of thought about it and said, "Well, daughter, it's quite simple. It's things we do every day. We brush our teeth in the morning and at night. We comb our hair every day. We take a shower or a bath every day to make ourselves clean. These are good habits." "Okay," she said. And off he went to work, and off she went. And when they came back at the end of the day, they had dinner, and the mother then, I think, put the children to sleep, and the father went in about 10 minutes later into the little girl's room, and he reported in our session, had her hand down her pants, and she was very clearly masturbating. And he interrupted Susie, and she sort of startled into awareness and stopped, and he said something like this. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like this. "Susie, what you're doing there, it's fine, but you don't do it at preschool or at the grocery store or anything like that, do you?" And she said, "Oh, no." And he sort of got curious, and he said, "How often do you do that?" And she thought for just a second, and she looked him right in the eye and said, "Just in the morning and at night. It's a habit." And he sort of startled a little, but he smiled and said, "Okay, you just be careful with yourself. Love you. Good night." Kissed her on the forehead and left. A little bit nervous, but he handled it. So those are the two extremes, the kind of parental intervention on the question of masturbation that seems appropriate and good and healthy, and the old lies that are punitive and dangerous and destructive, and that if parents are doing anything like this, they need to reevaluate their own psyche and their own mind, because that kind of harsh and punitive thing will generate, very well may generate, perversions later in these children. You cannot stop the development of sexuality in any kind of healthy way. It will happen. Sexuality is too primary, and sexuality happens early. More on this in just a few minutes. I will challenge parents to be careful with their children's masturbation. Let them figure out what's healthy, monitor them, ensure that you understand the meaning of the thing. And if there is a problem, first, before you punish a child for it, take a deep breath and evaluate your relationship to that child and what's happening. What does the child need? is always the first and appropriate question. All right, let's talk next about potty training, always everybody's favorite subject. The first thing we have to talk about is, this is America. Everybody wants to do things faster and better. We're kind of in a competition, and I have heard parents brag about how early their children are potty trained. That's a disaster. You cannot put a child on a schedule of potty training sooner than their sphincter muscles are connected to their neurological circuitry in their brain. Early is not better. All right? It appears that most of the good research on infant biological brain neurological development is fairly clear that the sphincter muscles are not adequately under the brain control, under the muscular control of the neuronal system until approximately 2 years. Now, I have heard parents brag and claim that they have got their baby potty trained by 18 months. That is an anomaly, and I question whether that's good for the children. It may be convenient as heck for the parents, but this is not about the parents' needs, it's about the children's needs. So the strong recommendation is around 2 years, and you begin slowly and carefully. Here's the critical part. The baby, the toddlers now, the toddlers, like their little creations, children will frequently make a poo, and they will come get their parents and want to show it to them. They're so proud of this little gift to the parents. The children inevitably sense the parents' attitudes. If the mother and the father's attitudes toward the baby's little creations, which they're so proud of, is one of disgust and anxiety, guess what? The child takes in that attitude, the emotional context. It isn't the words that the parents say so much as their underlying emotional presence, which the children pick up every nuance of. And if the parents are disgusted, if they're nauseated, if they have anxiety around defecation of their children, the children will take that in, and that is never good for the children. This is a stretch, I get it. But is parenting a true pleasure to the parents? Even the potty training, even the diaper changing, I get this is a stretch, but if you reveal disgust to your children, they think they're disgusting. They have no other way to understand what's happening. And so, at the very least, potty training has to be done without strictness, without harshness, without punishment. Accidents will happen. Now, if the child isn't potty trained by 3 or 4 years, something's wrong with the way things are going on. Again, there's balance here. Not too soon, not too late. Either edge of that spectrum seems like a problem. So we try for balance. We shoot for what I'll call the zone of reasonableness. Extremes on either side are bad. I think to bracket the parents who try too hard too soon to force the children into potty training for the parents' own bragging rights, the narcissistic parents, there's another set of parents who don't seem to care enough. Now, in Seattle, I don't want to name any names here, but there's a group called, and I don't even know if they still exist. I heard about them years ago, and maybe they've changed, but when I heard of them, there was a group called the Attachment Parenting Group. And they use the word attachment because that's a word that was created by John Bowlby to mean a very particular body of research about the way babies become emotionally attached to their caregivers. And they've used this word, which has great credibility in the psychological community, as a label to try to get credibility for their own little movement. And the problem is what they're doing is taking the position that a baby should never be stressed, should feel no anxiety, and the parents should just do everything. And it's specifically around the question of potty training that they seem to be extremists in the child development field. I have heard them talk about not potty training the children at all. They simply go behind them and clean up their messes. Their houses smell like Clorox. They let the children urinate and defecate wherever it moves them, and they never cause them any stress or anxiety about it, under the theory that they'll figure it out eventually and everything will be fine. This is This is negligent parenting bordering on abuse. Certainly neglect. The children must have boundaries. They must have some containment, which is inevitably frustrating for the child, inevitably somewhat painful, and that's part of appropriate development. The parents who believe their children should never be stressed at all, I think, are symptomatic. That is a problem in the parent's psyche. That says something about their history, and they're inflicting their own parental difficulties on their children. Extremists in both sides have to be resisted. There is a healthy zone of reasonableness within which a child can have difficulty and still flourish. That's what we're shooting for, zone of reasonableness. The only thing I would add here is it takes some coordination between potty training and weaning. It seems clear that you shouldn't do both at the same time, and they can happen around the same time. But I think it's very clear that if you begin a potty training regimen simultaneously with weaning the child off breastfeeding, that's too much for most children. Do one, then the other. Whatever feels appropriate for this child. They may have better skills in one area than the other. Let them do one, get that down before the other. There's no crisis. There's no dead set time frame developmental criteria that require it be done by X date. Let the child's needs drive the train within parameters. And it makes perfect sense not to try to burden the child with two very difficult things for the child simultaneously. All right, let's move into breastfeeding. I think it's an honest statement to say that parents, in this case the mother, cannot establish a happy relationship to the baby if nursing is felt by the mother to be a duty. To be a healthy, appropriate, child-focused mother, nursing that child should be a pleasure. It should be a fulfillment. It should be a joy. If you roll your eyes and say, oh my God, the little rugrat is hungry again, I guess I must serve the master. If your attitude is something like that to your child's feeding, you're in trouble, and so is the child. Because what's going on in a good feed at the breast with a baby is not just the transfer of nourishment, not by half. It appears that as important as the nourishment is the containment of the baby's anxiety, the containment of the baby's feeling states. And I think what happens practically is the baby takes in the calm and loving presence of the mother. We've called it introjection. We've called it identification. We've called it several things. It's about the baby taking in the experience of the mother's loving mind. The baby takes in both the breast milk and the loving mind of the mother. They're not separate. They shouldn't be in contradiction, and I don't think you can take one without the other well. So, the child takes in both the act and the attitude. Here's the question. What happens if you can't breastfeed? Melanie Klein is quite clear about this, and I think she's right. Can you raise a healthy, appropriate, normal baby without breastfeeding? The answer is, of course, yes. Happens all the time for lots of reasons. But it is not the same. It is not equal. And it will cause more difficulties for the child that have to be honest about, we have to be honest about, and we have to address, and we have to recognize. The biggest mistake is not breastfeeding, but pretending that not breastfeeding doesn't matter. Again, the bottle in the mouth, if it's in the context of a loving, containing mind of the mother or caregiver, can provide the child just about everything that's necessary. You stick a bottle in the mouth while you text someone, the child is being neglected, and neglected rather seriously. Breastfeeding is the most natural thing imaginable. It has been going on for 1 million years. It goes on in every mammalian species. The question is, why would a woman not be able to breastfeed? Some women don't breastfeed because they work, because they're busy, because they have other things to do. In this crazy world we're in, I can understand that. What I can't understand is not making arrangements so that the baby's developmental needs do not get met. You don't have to breastfeed. You have to pay attention to the needs of the child. And I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here and suggest that unless there are very good reasons, and I mean really good reasons, for not breastfeeding, that is the best way developmentally. Best way for the baby to develop, which means which is an achievement of the baby and the mother's relationship together, which is the bedrock for the baby's development. And I had a very sad case about 4 years ago. A mother came to me. She had raised 3 children. They were in their early teen years at the time, 2 boys and a girl in that order, boy, boy, girl. She had not breastfed the 2 boys. She did breastfeed the daughter. And that seemed odd because her assumption was initially that there was something wrong with her glands, something wrong with the ducts. She assumed it was some kind of medical condition, that the milk wouldn't let down, there was some clog, and she had some exams and could never figure it out. So she sort of shrugged her shoulders and did not breastfeed the 2 boys. The girl, 3rd child, came along, and lo and behold, the milk flowed and everything was fine. And so it wasn't physiological, or at least it didn't seem physiological. The 3rd child came relatively soon after the 2nd, and we worked on it for quite some time, and it slowly became clear to both of us that the meaning of her not feeding was quite problematic. That she slowly, through the work, recognized that she had a very ambivalent relationship with her father. At some level, she respected him as a father who had raised several children under difficult circumstances, and at another level, she hated him deeply. And it appeared to us, after a lot of painful work, that she associated her boys as males like her father. And unconsciously, completely unconsciously, that hatred for men, there's actually a word for it now, misandry. It's the girl version of misogyny. Misogyny, a man who hates women as woman. Well, turns out there is a female version of this, misandry. It appeared that she felt that way unconsciously. She was not aware of it, but her unconscious was so powerful, as all of ours are, that it inhibited the flow of her body's ability to provide nurturing milk for her sons, not her daughter. So with that sad story, to keep in mind that sad story, why would a mother not nurse? It turns out it's a lot more complicated than she's really busy. It may be more complicated. We have to ask the more fundamental question. I think it's reasonable to say that breastfeeding is the right and better way. Breastfeeding at the breast of a loving, containing, present, healthy mother is the ideal way to get the child's needs met. Weaning a child, stopping the breastfeeding at the appropriate time, is a little bit like potty training, a difficult calculation and an important developmental one. The key factor here is simply this. Weaning the child, which means stopping the breastfeeding, is not just about when you end the breastfeeding. If ever there was a case where it's not the thing, it's the meaning of the thing, this is it. Breastfeeding, weaning to the child is about the internal ability to manage frustration. Wean the child too soon and you leave the child with traumatic deprivation. It's a trauma the child can't handle, isn't developmentally capable, hasn't internalized enough love and strength to be able to experience this first catastrophic loss. And for many children, it is a catastrophic loss. The loss of the breast is tremendously painful for almost every child, and pathologically so if it's too early. So again, the timing. Is this child psychically prepared for the little trauma of weaning? Is the child capable of managing the frustration because they've taken in enough good, loving care? Their sense of their own self is strong enough, integrated enough, whole enough for them to survive this little loss or this loss. Because if they're not strong enough psychically, then they fall apart in the trauma. That's what trauma does to adults. if an adult experiences a trauma, that's what PTSD is all about. A trauma too terrible for the adult to manage, leaving psychic scarring and experiencing the symptomatic dynamics of that internal experience of the trauma. Now, I am not saying that too early weaning of a baby is going to cause PTSD. No, 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 no. What I'm saying is it's very clear that we have to be careful about the meaning of the weaning to the child. It's not when we think it should be done by some theory. It's when we have accomplished sufficient developmental growth in the child's mind to ensure that the weaning is in fact part of the developmental progression. Yes, it's going to be painful. Yes, it's going to be frustrating. And if the child is in a place to be able to handle it, then it actually fosters that child's growth and is not traumatic in the damaging way. Okay, what's the best time? And again, there isn't a scientific answer to this. I think the best literature that I have read suggests a reasonable window, 2 to 3 years. If it's before 3 years, that's probably too soon. Melanie Klein, as great as she was in many areas, was simply wrong about this. She actually said 6 months. And if you look back at her biography, you can see there's a fair argument here. And I may get into some trouble with some Kleinians about this, but she wasn't a particularly good mother. She was quite a good clinician and quite a good theoretician, and she was quite a good observer of what babies needs. But I think her 6 month was more about her own issues than about the needs of the baby she was watching. The recent literature on this is clear. Call it 2 to 3 years, give or take. There is the extremists on the other side. Time magazine just this year had a cover story of a woman in her looked like late 20s, early 30s, and she was standing straight up, and her 3.5-year-old son was standing on a stool at the breast, nipple in mouth, and both of them had their eyes toward the camera. It was designed to sell magazines. It was designed to be controversial. It was designed to be a little outrageous and sell magazines. But there is a group of people, a bit like I think the extremists in the attachment parenting group, that say the child should not be weaned until it's ready. Well, that's crazy. If the child is 3.5, 4, 5, 6, and they're still breastfeeding, something's seriously wrong with the program. So again, 2 to 3 years. If there's a little flexibility on both sides, fine. We're not going to be harsh and regimented about this. But much beyond that, we're going to have to start asking harder questions about what the meaning of that thing is for those parents and that child. That seems reasonable and balanced. I'm going to throw something in that isn't talked about in the readings, and that's the disciplining of toddlers, of very young children. And the short answer to this is, it's wrong. Don't do it. There's nothing that an 18-month-old child can do that's wrong. Wrong, immoral, bad, that deserves punishment. We have to get that out of our minds. It's like the masturbation. There's nothing an 18-month-old child can do that's sinful, evil, bad, wrong, or deserves punishment. They're energetic, they're learning, they're confused, they're not even whole people yet. They're struggling toward that in a difficult world, with an internal world rife with conflict and intense emotions. And I had a case when I worked for an agency where a woman who herself was barely grown up, I think she was 18 years old, and she had an 18-month-old son. And in the housing area that they were in, they occasionally had visitors, and she came to therapy one day and told me the story of her boyfriend who had come over, and they were watching television, and the boyfriend at some point got angry and took his belt off and was hitting this 18-month-old toddler with a belt. And when I kind of stopped her in a bit of shock myself, and I said, why was he doing that? And the young woman said, well, my son disrespected him. And I was confused, and I thought about that for a minute, and I said, if someone else were to hear about this, you could have CPS take your child away. You could lose custody. That is really serious child abuse. And I don't think there's anybody that would argue that. So that has to stop now. And I thought about it for a long time. Parents do not understand that children aren't adult. That sounds silly. Children don't have coherent senses of their own identity, coherent, integrated understandings of the role of parents, or even who or that these are other people. They are playing with a chaotic, crazy world. And I don't think an 18-month-old has the ability to disrespect anybody. They don't even understand who they are or who other people are. How can they show disrespect? So the advice around questions of discipline is very simple. Recognize your child as a bundle of energy. Recognize they are trying and they're not very good at anything. And they're going to get into stuff, and they're going to get into stuff they shouldn't. Channel that energy. Do not stifle it. Do not punish it. Do not whip it. Channel that energy. Distract them with something they should, could, or need to do developmentally that's healthy. Positive reinforcement is the key at this young age. It is a completely different question, which I will address later at some time, I think, about whether corporal discipline, spanking, is appropriate for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, okay? That's a hotly disputed, almost political issue, and we'll get to it later. But I think it is reasonable to say that below ages 3 and 4, that the kind of discipline and punishment involved in some parental dynamics simply is a misguided symptom on the part of the parents. You can't spank an 18-month-old baby for doing something that wrong. They don't understand it. It doesn't help. It damages them. It damages their connection to the parents. It generates lack of trust and trauma and feelings of abandonment and feelings of guilt. And down that road goes more mental illnesses than I care to number. Okay. Next one. Soothing. This is, I think, fairly simple. We need to soothe our distressed babies and toddlers, and they get into a lot of distress. The baby will be playful with the mother's body. They should be. There should be looking and smiling and talking and moving back and forth physically. The baby should hear the sound of the mother's voice frequently. It should be a calm and loving voice, not a scratchy, screechy, harsh, demanding, threatening, yelling voice. Simple rule. Simple rule. Any child under the age of 4 cannot be yelled at. It's Donovan Bigelow's rule of childhood parenting, discipline, and soothing. No yelling and screaming at any kid under 4. Let me change that. No yelling and screaming at anybody, anytime, for any reason. If you are yelling and screaming, you are failing as a partner, you are failing as a parent. There is no excuse and no explanation and nothing developmentally good for the child in a mother or a father who is screaming. Stop it, it's bad, it says something bad about you and it's hurting the children. Let me think. Shall I tell you what I really think? Do you think I'm withholding anything here? Maybe I'm in denial. No, I'm going to stick with just what I said. I think it's true, I think it's right, and parents who yell and scream have to stop and look at what they're doing to their children and what it means inside them. The mother must realize, this is a great line from Klein, the mother must realize that the baby is not actually her possession. It is utterly dependent, but must be treated as a human being with the potential for independence for the good of both of them. That feels like poetry to me. That's beautiful. All right, we're still in the soothing section. Do you let a child cry itself to sleep at night? Are you crazy to even ask the question? Everything we've talked to up to now says not only no, but hell no. If the child is crying, it is in distress. Children's fantasies, the scope of their emotions are so powerful. To leave a child alone to cry itself to sleep is to leave it in a literal hell. If you don't know what's wrong, figure it out as best you can. If you can't, get some help. But to abandon the child to a locked door is one of the worst forms of child neglect, if not abuse, imaginable to the child. Figure out what soothing needs to be done and do it in the presence of the baby. Letting them cry themselves to sleep seems to me to be a very bad policy. It's probably generated by exhausted parents who are at a loss to do whatever it is they thought they could do and they can't do anymore, and they're at the end of their rope. And you know what? Maybe letting the child cry itself to sleep is better than beating it. I suppose that's true. But if you're at that point, you need to call in some help. Okay? So, no allowing the child to cry itself to sleep. What the child needs is the music of the mother's voice. And there's something, maybe I've mentioned this before, but it's worth in this section mentioning again. Why is it that of all the art forms, only music goes straight to our emotions? That we can have a direct emotional response to an opera, to a song, to a rhythm, a musical rhythm. It isn't even, sometimes the words aren't nearly as important as the emotion that they have the ability to evoke. And all other art forms, statues, sculpture, painting, landscape painting, still lifes, any other type or form of art first gets filtered through our intellect. We look at the form, we look at the shape, we find it interesting, we contemplate it. Not music. Music goes straight to our heart. Why? Because it's the first art, and it represents an evocation of the mother's voice, and possibly even more deeply, an evocation of the mother's very heartbeat. Musical rhythms evoke in the child the experience of the womb and the rhythmic mother's heartbeat. The song of the mother, the soothing voice of the mother backs that up, parallels that, is in the same genre as that. The soothing tone of a loving mother's presence is the most soothing thing a child can have. And I think there's continuity here in our adult lives. We know as adults what music can do to us. If music doesn't transport you, something's wrong. You need to listen to some better music, perhaps. But soothing, you need to understand that as a parent, that tone of voice isn't just about what you're saying to the child, because you know the child doesn't understand most of what you say. It's not the meaning of the words. It's the meaning of the thing. It's the meaning of the fact of voice, of inflection, of rhythm, of tone, and the loving emotions that back that up and surround it, contain it. So, never yell at the child. Sing to them. Okay, now we have to move on to the sexual development. Now because this is parallel to the masturbation section, and in addition to it, this is the part that I get the most reaction to from most parents and would-be parents. So I want to do something a little unusual, and I apologize in advance. I'm going to read you a rather long couple of paragraphs from Melanie Klein's actual text called Weaning. It's about sexual development. I will then go over it and try to walk you through it. But I want you to have this verbatim. It's important. I don't want to get a word wrong, and I want you to take in every bit of it. Here we go. I apologize. This is not a good teaching technique. I know that, but bear with me. This is important. The sexual development of the child. That is, his experiences of bodily sexual sensations and accompanying desires and feelings. It is not yet generally realized that the infant from birth onwards has strong sexual feelings, which to begin with manifest themselves through the pleasure experienced in his mouth, activities, and excretory functions, but which very soon get connected with the genitals as well, as in masturbation. Nor is it generally and sufficiently realized that these sexual feelings are essential for the proper development of the child, and that his personality and character, as well as a satisfactory adult sexuality, depend on his sexuality being established in childhood. This may be the most important paragraph you've ever read about child development. Sexuality, adult sexuality, begins the day its development begins the day the child is born, and possibly even before. All right. But that alone is not sufficient. This is it. The mother must have a really friendly attitude toward these manifestations of his sexuality. So often she is apt to show disgust, harshness, or scorn, which is both humiliating and detrimental to the child. Since all his erotic trends are directed first and foremost toward his mother and father, their reactions will influence his whole development in these matters. On the other hand, there is also the question of too great an indulgence to be considered. Though the child's sexuality is not to be interfered with, the mother might have to restrain him, of course, in a friendly way, if he should attempt to take too much liberty with her person. Neither must the mother allow herself to become involved in his sexuality. A really friendly acceptance of sexuality in her child constitutes the limit of her role. Let me say that again. That's critical. The mother's attitude. A really friendly acceptance of his sexuality, of sexuality in her child, constitutes the limit of her role. Children will exhibit what look like inevitably erotic sensations. They will feel that you can see it in their bodies. You can hear it in the tones of their sounds. You can see it in their faces. There are proto-erotic manifestations. There are precursors to sexuality. And I said it before, I think, in the other developmental class, that there isn't an adult type sexuality going on here. That is not what's going on. No theoretician has ever claimed that babies and toddlers can have adult style sexual fantasies. That's ridiculous. That's gross. Nobody's saying that. But everyone who's ever done any serious research in the last 50 years are in unanimous understanding about this, that there are direct sexual, erotic, precursor feelings and experiences. The bedrock, the building block of adult sexuality gets laid down quite literally beginning the day the child is born. And that's what she's talking about here. A really friendly acceptance of sexuality in her child constitutes the limit of her role. Her own erotic needs must be well controlled where he is concerned. She must not become passionately excited by any of her activities in tending the child. When washing, drying, or powdering him, restraint is necessary, particularly in connection with the genital regions. The mother's lack of self-control may easily be felt by the child as a seduction, and this would set up undue complications in his development. Yet the child should by no means be deprived of love. The mother certainly can and ought to kiss and caress him and take him on her lap, all of which he needs and is only to his good. I have not read a better balanced, sane, appropriate discussion of the sexual development of children and the necessity of parents recognizing the beauty, the simplicity, the necessity of the child's budding proto-sexuality and to foster that as part of its creative growth. So, is the parent's attitude truly a friendly one? Or are there, when the parent sees vestiges of or precursors to sexual development, is the parent punishing? Is the parent harsh, denying, demeaning, threatening? It happens all too often. What is the parent's attitude once they realize they've got a little sexualized creature on their hands? It had better be a friendly attitude, and if it's not, the parent needs some help. The mother's needs. And the mother will have her own erotic needs. They must be elsewhere. Everyone knows parents whose needs are met through the children. That cannot be. The parents who won't let their children go because they need to be seen as the good parent. This is dangerous and difficult. And it's particularly a problem when the child becomes eroticized to the mother or the father. Maybe it's worse when it happens in the father. It's bad for both. Healthy adult sexuality begins at birth. Question here on, do you ever expose the child to the parent's sexuality? Is it ever okay to have babies, toddlers in the room if the parents are having some sexual contact? The answer is no. It seems, though I suppose there's some tiny minority opinion here, it seems going back 60, 70 years, the literature is mostly consistent. The experience that the baby, young toddler, is having in the parent's bedroom is, in a way, traumatic. The child first is woken up, which is always unpleasant, uncomfortable, and does not help development. And then, because we have always failed to recognize how sophisticated young children's minds and brains and emotions are, they do experience something in the connection to the parental sexual dynamic. They feel the feelings, they will hear the sounds. It generates feelings in them that are not healthy for their own development. It generates frustrations, it generates envy, it generates fantasies of what's happening. And it appears to me virtually always that exposing children to parental sexual activity is always bad. Sexual activity of a specifically erotic nature, penile vaginal intercourse or anything like that is what I'm talking about here, folks. Now, is it okay for the parents to hug and kiss in front of their children? Of course it is. How else is the child supposed to take in an appropriate adult, adolescent even, interaction? We get to show them a great deal of love and affection between the parents. I think a reasonable line gets drawn when sex gets involved. Where we draw the line, let's try to err on the side of the child's developmental needs, not on the parent's need to have sex with the child in the room. Now, that seems damaging, virtually always and virtually without exception. I will, for the sake of argument, take the other side and show a different case. Children are curious. Children want to know stuff. And it seems to me that children are consistently the most curious about bodies, about sexuality. They seem to instinctively know something that's true, that we are sexual creatures and we have a curiosity about our bodies and the bodies of our parents, inevitably and undeniably. And unless parents are very, very careful, they will see things. They will try to see things. They will sneak around and observe. And I had a patient last year, a father this time, come in and describe the household arrangements. He had 2 daughters, and was it the eldest or the youngest? I think it was the eldest, and she must have been 4 or 5. Not exactly sure of the ages now. I kind of forget. But they had arrangements in their house where the girls slept upstairs on this end of the house, and the parents slept downstairs on the other side of the house. They had a lock on the bedroom door. They did this consciously. They knew stuff. So, and I apologize if this is a little too graphic for anybody, but I'll try to be respectful. The parents were, one night after the children were put to bed, making love. And they were young and energetic, and it was taking a long time, and let's call it approximately 30 minutes into their various maneuvers, they hear from the foot of their bed, tee-hee, and then they hear footsteps up the stairs. Oh my God. They're both shocked, they're both horrified, they're both scared, they don't know what to do. And the father related this story that he sort of calmed down, took a deep breath, put his robe on, and said, I can handle this, and went upstairs and figured out which one it was and went into the daughter's room, and she was laying there all a-twitter. And he related this series of questions. He asked her, Susie, what did you see? Notice the tone of voice. It was friendly. It was curious. He said, what did you see? And the little girl smiled and said, a lot. And the father, curious, said, how did that make you feel? And the little girl said, well, no, let me back up. What did you see? What did you think about that? At first, I thought you were hurting Mommy. Then I could tell you weren't. Now, Freud talked about this. Working with only adult patients, he said, he came to believe, and he was right about this, that children who observe their adult parents' sexual intimacies inevitably, at first, think it's violent. They think it's aggressive and hostile, and they worry about people being hurt. And God knows that makes sense if you think about the positions and the noises the children probably hear. And in a way, it's almost fortunate that this young girl stayed long enough to figure out that it wasn't, in fact, a violent act being perpetrated from one parent to another. That certainly would have been quite damaging. So she said, and then I could tell you weren't. And the father then asked one more question in as friendly a manner as he could. He asked, how did that make you feel? And she said, and when he said this to me, he put his head in his hands and shook his head. It was traumatic for him to have heard this. She said, and I quote, "It made my crotch tingle." And he said, okay, well, there's things little girls and boys should not see, and I promise you we'll explain it all when you get a little older. But for right now, you stay in bed. Love you. Kiss on the forehead. And down the stairs he went, pale and shaken, I think. It made my crotch tingle. She was 4. She was a sexualized creature. She was honest. She has no idea what it meant. And yet, seeing this sexual experience did something sexual to her bodily and emotional dynamic. Now, the way he handled it seemed perfectly appropriate. He then went on with the mother to explain some things in an age-appropriate way as the children developed, and there was nothing I could tell that seemed problematic about the results of that interlude. So everybody relax. If the child sees you doing something, handle it properly. Make sure it doesn't happen again, or certainly very often, and deal with the developmental vicissitudes of that experience with honesty and curiosity and with some hopeful humor and patience. And if you do that, most of the time everything will be fine. Okay. A few closing points. It seems consistent since Freud that babies and toddlers have been underestimated intellectually and emotionally. They do understand things. They do take things in at much more sophisticated levels than we've ever given them credit for. And their emotional life is much more intense, much more vivid. Higher highs, lower lows, more dramatic rages and anxiety and fear and hate, which kills us to think about the possibility of our darling little girls and boys with that kind of intensity, possibly in that kind of pain, seems impossible, and we don't want to hear the truth of that. And on the other side, they're capable of such intense love, intense devotion, such incredible desire, commitment, love, that it's almost overwhelming to think about that. We must respect the children's mind. Everything we put into them from birth and probably before, through up to and including adolescence and adulthood, but especially in these first 3 or 4 years, that lays all the important building blocks for all of their adult sexuality, all of their relationships, all of their creative work, all of their professional development. Will lay the building blocks for who they are in every domain. And this is a very passionate plea for nothing more than a reevaluation of your role as a parent. Can you take this material, focus on the child's needs, get the help you need to get your head on straight if you need to, make the changes you now see through this material are necessary for you to be the kind of parent that can provide that necessary, loving, foundational containment so that your children grow up healthy, happy, and give you someday the pleasure and the privilege of healthy and happy grandchildren. I hope so. Thank you very much.